Hey, thanks so much for joining. This is one of the long-awaited episode, at least for me and today's guest, Gray Crawford. Thanks, Gray, for joining. So,
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
thank you so much. So, I've been in lookout for whom to talk about this great landmark book by Richard Tarnas, uh, Cosmos and Psyche. So I read it about. I think I read it 2 years ago or close to 2 years ago, which kind of ignited my approach towards psychological astrology or archetypal astrology, because I come from predominantly a Vedic background, which is largely predictive oriented. I won't say Vedic astrology was designed in such a way that it had to be predictive, but uh, the the philosophy of the Indian astrologers over the past 2000 years has kind of changed over a period of time. I mean, over the 2000 years, and today Vedic astrology is largely seen as a predictive form of astrology. And for that matter, I think all forms of traditional astrology is kind of seen as predictive astrology. But what Richard Tarnas and his predecessors, I don't know who his predecessors are, but I think I would like to call Carl Jung and people who come in his line of doing astrology, who had a lot of psychology approach or depth psychology oriented approach. So, where some of the archetypal meanings of specific planetary positions and its manifestations were dealt with. So, and the main reason why I wanted to talk about Cosmos and Psyche is because I think Cosmos and Psyche is a perfect gateway for someone to enter into astrology, not just modern astrology or not traditional astrology or not medieval astrology, but any form of astrology. I think Cosmos and Psyche will act as a great entry point to any person, because the person who wrote this is Dr. Richard Tarnas, and Richard Tarnas comes from academic background, and almost anyone who comes from an academic or a scientific background has only rejected or debunked astrology. As we know, it is a very common, it is a very common thought that everyone has. Scientists usually debunk astrology, academicians usually debunk astrology, but Richard Tarnas is one of those lighted minds and brilliant minds who kind of had the interest to bother about, care, and read what astrology is and what astrology could offer. And he had a lot of deep studies in the subject, and finally he wrote a book on that subject, even without mentioning astrology for a larger part of the book, mentioning the word astrology for the larger part of the book. So uh, which is actually not so likely trait for an academician or a scientist to kind of take up astrology and try to project astrology on a good light or something like that. So, which is one of the reasons why I found Richard Tarnas's work to be very commendable. On the other side, it does not come from someone who is just from academic background. Okay, he's probably one of the important writers of our times. If I've read portions of Passion of the Western Mind, and I've read Cosmos and Psyche almost. I've read portions of that book more than 2 or 3 times, but I've read the book cover to cover once. So, which is, and I feel that it is one of the most important books of our times. So, and thank you so much for joining again, because I really couldn't find anyone who will be suitable to kind of talk about this particular book except for Richard Tarnas, but I wanted to talk with someone else, and I think you were the best fit that I found. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Well, I want to thank you too for playing into my Saturn opposition. I'm in the middle of a Saturn opposition transit right now, and offering me to talk about this book, I definitely feel the weight of that type of gravity and responsibility, because it is such a landmark book. And I'm not somebody that actually has ever directly studied under Rick Tarnas. I have not attended his school or any of the schools actually associated with him. but he has been a definitely very major influence on me, and I would say it is a landmark book, and he is one of the more important intellectual figures, I would say, of the current zeitgeist and time period. It's very fascinating when this book came out. It came out in 2006, 2007, I believe is when it was first published. Yeah. And one thing really interesting about that is it came out essentially at the same time that Pluto was being demoted to a dwarf planet, as well as Eris being introduced as a dwarf planet, as well as Ceres, the asteroid goddess, being elevated to a dwarf planet, making her kind of more like the lady or the queen of the asteroid belt. But Tarnas is basically drawing, this is coming on it's also at a point, I feel like, in the history of astrology, where in the Western tradition, when this book came out, it was sort of like about 15 or 16 years or so, 20 years or so into a much more intensified effort at reviving the Western astrology tradition. That's why it's really interesting to speak with you, coming from India, the Vedic and Jyotish perspective, where you never lost that lineage. But just that, that opening of the book is something I'd really like us to spend some time talking about, because you're right, he doesn't mention astrology until, I don't know what page, is it like around like the first, not to like 70 or 60 pages or 50 pages or so. It's not really into that point where he even mentions astrology, like you're saying. And those first 50 or 60 pages of this book are just so dense and loaded with this amazing perspective that is very much an effort to sort of draw people in to considering where we are right now in terms of the development of the modern self, and particularly from this sort of Western academic tradition in which the universe was really ended up being stripped of meaning. He talks a lot about the disenchantment of the cosmos. But the other thing about this book, besides that whole opening, which is really rich for us to explore, there's also methodical, incredible compilation of historical correlations across time with the planets from Jupiter basically outward. So looking at Jupiter and Saturn as the faster moving planets, and then focusing a lot on Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and drawing from his descriptions of like Saturn actually and Jupiter and the inner planets actually are a very good match for traditional astrological significations. And he also then does an amazing job of synthesizing and compiling all of the significations of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto that were developed since their discoveries, which I know for someone like you, coming from your perspective, is something new to really be learning, because it wouldn't be even typically used in Vedic astrology.
Sure.
And yeah, and so he sort of, I feel like right when Pluto was getting demoted, he just plants this book that very much shows the significance of Pluto and how it shows up over and over and over again. And, these times we've been living through, you can look at it very much through a lens of Uranus-Pluto square that we went through earlier in the decade, transitioning into this Saturn-Pluto time period that we're in, exactly in this moment. And we can speak to that as well. I would say it's just my relationship with him. I remember when I first saw this book in a bookstore, I don't actually remember what year it was, but it was probably 10 or 11 years ago, something like that, or maybe 12 years ago at the most. And it was interesting, right? I had been learning 20th century astrology, so the way he's describing Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, fit in with my own understanding in that time. And I was at a very early stage of understanding transits. I had recently gone through a master in teaching program where I had actually thought about teaching history. And I had actually, it was funny, before I saw this book, I'd actually in my own mind thought about, oh, it'd be really cool to write some book about, I was just, excited. I was just at an early stage of realizing how these cycles line up as historical trends. And, when you first hear about something, you get really excited. You're like, oh, I should write a book. And then I remember seeing this in the bookstore, and I was like, oh, that's, that book's already written. And not only that, though, this book goes, far beyond. It's an amazing legacy. I mean, just to talk a little bit, what I know about Rick Tarnas, at least, his background, right? I believe he had even a sort of a Jesuit, somewhat classical education, which is very classical for like Western academic, tradition. And, previous intellectual pioneers like James Joyce, for example, had a Jesuit education. He then goes to Harvard, which in our country and culture is sort of like the idealized epitome of intellectual academia. But he's going through there during the 60s and living through that Uranus-Pluto conjunction time period, coming across figures like Ram Dass and Alan Watts, heading into the Esalen community, and we're collaborating with figures like Stanislav Grof, meeting people like Joseph Campbell, being friends with Grof, being friends with Joseph Campbell, being friends with James Hillman, where these people were not just people he was reading in a book, but they were people he actually knew and, was able to collaborate with and mentor and, so forth. So he really just he's just sort of like the ideal person to develop this work. And he did it. I mean, it's an example of somebody working a really long time on these ideas and finally delivering them. And as you mentioned, that Passion of the Western Mind, that was the initial book that came out.
Sure.
And apparently that was originally written because he was intending to write Cosmos and Psyche the whole time, and he was going to write out, sort of as part of that masterful introduction in Cosmos and Psyche, he wanted to write out, what's the lineage of archetypes to really explain that. And then I realized, this is actually should be its own book. And that was Passion of the Western Mind, which was sort of a gateway. It established him as a very prominent, academic, intellectual figure whose book's being taught in universities. But then he comes out with this book, which is talking about astrology like it's a real thing, which is really different because most academics in the history in Western culture, the ones that will even talk about astrology, they always kind of will throw in little jabs here and there. Like, there's a really good example. I think it's Thomas More, who's very influenced by Hillman. I might have his name wrong. He has this really great book about Marsilio Ficino and the Renaissance in astrology, which is bringing forward a lot of Ficino's ideas, but he keeps throwing in little jabs here and there, almost like trying to make people know, like, well, it's not like I totally believe in all this, even though. So that's kind of typical, and it's sort of like you couldn't be academically credible if you're talking about astrology as existing, which is part of the whole paradigm shift that he's talking about in this book. Yeah.
So, talking about Saturn, so there is a lot of Saturn connection as well, because I'm just trying to close in from my first Saturn return. So,
okay.
Richard Tarnas, so talking about Richard Tarnas was amazing because I did not have much of an idea about who Richard Tarnas was, except from the fact that I knew that he was an academician and and a scholar. So just getting into the book, the first page in terms of preface, he starts with this exact word. This statement: skepticism is the chastity of the intellect. The mind that seeks the deepest intellectual fulfillment doesn't give itself up to every passing idea. So skepticism is good, but skepticism is only good if you have the guts to kind of get into the subject, research it, and try to find it whether it actually works or not. So if not, skepticism is it can be really unhealthy and it can also lead to a lot of ugly arguments, as how it is happening today, as the scientific community is kind of debunking. It's almost funny that I today read a post shared by Astrological Association, which was again a debunk on astrology, which made me think about a lot of things. Probably this is not the right platform to kind of talk about that. That is, again, I mean, actually probably make a specific video or write an article about criticizing their, statements. But still, the point that I'm getting at here is that skepticism is not healthy unless and until we have the intellectuality to kind of get into that subject and try to learn it. But Richard Tarnas, he had this drive in his mind to uh, peep into astrology and see what it really is, and probably he got bit by the astrology bug. So not many people
Yeah.
who look into astrology from an overview kind of resist from it, because everyone gets pulled in. That's what astrology is. So everyone has some kind of intensity or degree of curiosity within them, and the inquisitiveness will probably not let you kind of go away from astrology, and it will kind of pull in. Richard Tarnas is fortunately one of those victims who as an academician, who fell to astrology, and produced this mammoth publication, which is probably going to be celebrated for many years and generations to come. So dealing with skepticism with a lot of intellectuality is probably where Richard Tarnas won over a lot of other academicians and scientists who just basically debunk astrology without getting into a proper test or research. Robert Hand, in his episode, one of the podcast episodes with Chris Brennan, said that you cannot debunk astrology unless and until you have a proper testable sample or hypothesis, and whatever you're using is not even good. And I come to it from another angle, saying that there is no real scientific equipment that is as as advanced even in the 21st century to kind of debunk or even test astrology. And that is where we are at. So it does not matter even if this is the age of Uranus. You need much more or bigger stuff to kind of test astrology and prove it, because there is the intuitive factor that Richard Tarnas kind of layers it and kind of maneuvers it through almost all the chapters in dealing with archetypes or psychological archetypes of a specific planetary placement is not something that you get by test, but it is it is based upon the individual of an astrologer. It is based upon the intuition of an individual to kind of come up with specific attributes and astrological statements about a specific placement. So I don't think there is any reason, or I don't know why you would test astrology as a science. I would never kind of venture to that path, but I think Richard Tarnas is completely different from other group of academicians, and he kind of delivered this amazing thing and tried to project astrology on a good light. So I think skepticism is good, but it should be used in a positive manner, which Richard Tarnas did, and his preface kind of talks about it extensively. So that's what I thought.
Yeah, I mean, the skepticism point you're making is really important, and I think it'd be good for us to spend a little bit of time just going through a little bit what he's talking about there at the beginning. But sort of as he mentions, it's including in kind of in part of his critique of the postmodernist perspective, that sort of everything's just relative, and we're just in this like chaotic flux of void where we're just projecting our own. The human is just projecting meaning onto this chaotic, meaningless universe. That in and of itself is its own blinder, skepticism itself, you can be, in other words, you can take a skepticist attitude towards those very skepticists that are acting like they are the objective guardians of this, some sort of belief of objective truth that they're having. And just like you're saying, typically people that criticize astrology haven't taken the time to understand it. I also note that people that criticize the work of Carl Jung and say it has nothing to do with astrology, that criticize a depth psychological perspective and that it has nothing to do with astrology, tend to, when they're talking about it, reveal the fact that they actually don't understand the work of Carl Jung, and they don't really understand a depth psychological perspective. And that's one of the things I feel is very important about Cosmos and Psyche, is showing the value of what Jung was doing. At this point, actually, with some of the work Liz Green and others have done, we actually know that Carl Jung was doing everything he could to find traditional texts on astrology and learning from older figures, just like the traditional revival in astrology is happening today. So with the book, like you're right, it starts with a skepticism, but right when we get into the very first page of the book, hold on, I'm just trying to find my notes here on it. He's talking about the 23-year-old Pico della Mirandola delivering the oration on the dignity of man. This is around in 1486 in the Italian Renaissance. And he's showing this as sort of being this sort of idealized expression of this idea of the Western modern self, in which he says, humans are constrained by no limits. We're given total free will in this way of being able to be completely dynamic, creative, self-defining, self-creating, infinitely aspiring, set apart from the whole, overseeing the rest of the world with this unique sovereignty. And what he's the sort of precursor to this, what he talks about, which is so important, is the Copernicus revolution, and how the Copernicus revolution was this complete paradigm shift that it's very difficult to even imagine in our minds how much of a paradigm shift this was. And in fact, all of old astrology was based on this geocentric perspective. And, now we can argue that's still valid because we're on Earth and we have this, geocentric perspective here. But it's a completely paradigm shattering event that was completely dismissed by all intellectuals of the time, by all religious authorities of the time, by all guardians of the cultural viewpoint of the time. And the sort of hidden message there is that that's actually the same situation we find ourselves in today with astrology. You can't talk about astrology as being a valid thing without being automatically dismissed by all the intellectuals, all the authorities, in our present day and age. And the interesting thing is those early people that realized the Copernicus revolution, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, with my limited understanding of, in particularly Kepler, definitely had this sort of Neoplatonic, they had this embedded spiritual understanding with what they were doing. They believed in Pythagoras and these Platonic ideals, that they were discovering this divine message of the creator. And that, we're going around the sun. The sun is this luminous symbol of this divine force. But because, over time, as science and different ideas of, this idea that human reason and human rationality could actually figure out this, this greater cosmic paradigm that we're actually moving through, that we could actually figure this out, over time, this turned into this dominance of human reason. It turned into this intellectual framework that we're living in this disenchanted cosmos where all the meaning is, we're creating meaning from our human reason and rationality, that the humans are set apart from the rest of creation. The humans are this image of the divine, and the world is out there for us just to manipulate and meet our own needs. But what he makes the key point ultimately, though, is that now in India, of course, the astrological tradition was never lost. But in Western culture, what happened was that astrological tradition was lost here. And it was sort of stamped out by that worldview that gets developed, right, where you can't, it's impossible to talk about astrology having meaning anymore. The key point, I feel like one of the key points he makes is that it was necessary for that to happen in order for this idea of the modern self to emerge, so that ultimately, and this is kind of where we are today, we can take all this insight we've developed, this realization of the depth psychology and the unknown of the unconscious, and we can re-engage with the cosmos in this more participatory way that's co-creative. Instead of being, stuck in this sort of deterministic paradigm. And one of the things I think is really beautiful that he does in this opening is he sort of mentions this idea of Joseph Campbell. In Western culture, we have this idea of like the hero's myth, and that all these myths of heroes, part of it will involve like kind of separating from the community and going out on this quest. And as part of this, there's always like this sort of dark night of the soul, or like this descent into darkness and confrontation with like these archetypal forces. And so what he does is he talks about that there's a sort of dawn of this new paradigm of like the Enlightenment. And this is all coming out of the Copernicus revolution. And interestingly, that Copernicus revolution started with like people like Kepler actually having this exalted sort of spiritual perspective with what they were doing. Like they were combining spirit with science, but it turned into this over time, this like mechanistic more type of viewpoint, this overly rational viewpoint. And then sort of what he says is the depth psychology revolution that happens at the turn of the 20th century, just like the Copernicus revolution, decentered the Earth as being the center of the universe, and that instead of the sun being the center of the universe, it's orbiting the sun. And now we know there's multiple universes. There's this great decentering of this great unknown out there. Depth psychology then decentered this idea of this conscious ego, rational self that's in control of everything, and that actually it's on this periphery of this vast unknown unconscious within us. And similar, an interesting thing, there's this mirroring thing where this comes out of a time period where psychology was a little bit more deterministic, where Freud talked about the unconscious as being connected to instincts, but it sort of had a little bit more of a like cause effect type of thing with like the unconscious is like these biological instincts and that sort of thing. Whereas Jung and people like William James in America take it in this direction that, Jung split with Freud primarily because of Jung realizing the universal spiritual quality of humans and reconnecting the unconscious with this idea of spirit, this idea of soul, this idea that we're embedded actually in the world soul, this idea of the anima mundi, going back to figures like, Plotinus, resurrecting the term of the archetype, going all the way back, to like Plato, and sort of the all the forces that were actually at work, leading into like when we're talking about astrology, like Hellenistic astrology. So he sort of shows then how, we're at this point of time now. It's just really fascinating because I think because of his close relationship with people like Stanislav Grof, James Hillman, and Rick Tarnas really, he has actually this deep understanding of depth psychology, and he's able to intellectually show how it connects back to this whole history of philosophy and science all the way across time. So if anybody's just reading this book, like, you know, the first like 50 or 60 pages, you can't really, it's an impressive display of his grasp of all of this. And so to me, that is why it's such a great gateway. I would say, like, it might be, depending on who the person is, I guess, because it's definitely not simple ideas as far as being the first astrology book you read. But I do agree with you that it is a great book to come across, because I think it also helps with not becoming so deterministic with our astrology. And of course, from your perspective, coming from India, you have the lineage there has a much longer tradition of it being very predictive and learning how to work with it. In culture here, like in America, for example, there's a lot of interest in resurrecting the Western tradition and Hellenistic astrology, which gets more predictive. And then when people start talking about this, sometimes they actually start sounding pretty deterministic. And so they're oftentimes missing this depth psychological perspective, that archetypes are fundamentally relational, and you can have a relationship with these archetypes. You can have a relationship with your chart. The way your chart manifests across time can change. It's not this rigid, locked-in thing. So, yeah, sorry, I know I'm rambling there, so I'll stop.
I think it was amazing. I just got immersed, and I don't think I really have anything more to add to that. Just, I think we can just continue talking about about how Tarnas implies synchronicity into this concept. Synchronicity is largely a depth psychology concept and Carl Jung concept, but I think synchronicity is. Do you think we should just kind of define or talk about what synchronicity necessarily is? Because
Sure.
if we go back to ancient traditions, it is not much different from the word called divination. So, but I think it would be great to hear from you. To know about what synchronicity really is.
Yeah. Well, it's a really complex topic, and yeah. I don't know all the. I can't say I'm a total expert on all of it, but I've had synchronicity has been a massive shaping force in my life. And in fact, when I was younger, I had very disorienting experiences, which I realize now were because of these major synchronicities happening to me that at the time were very disorienting to me, because if synchronicities, if you're coming from this overly rational, human reason dominated perspective, that we're just projecting meaning on the world, that we can make up any meaning that we want, which unfortunately I think we've reached the epitome of that with, like, in our country with like Donald Trump as a president. Synchronicities, it's hard to understand. It's so disorienting because it completely breaks with the paradigm. It's extremely meaningful coincidences occurring where so Tarnas ultimately sort of uses synchronicity as a way to explain how astrology is always working. That there's a way that it makes me think about back in the philosophy of like Plotinus, and that idea that if you're divination with like the being an augur, or like paying attention to the flight of birds, or birds being an omen of something. Exactly. The birds are not the reason for that event to happen. But it's about a coincidence, and I mean it's all about the patterns that kind of gets formed, or we may say that there are various patterns in the universe that kind of give us some specific answer about what is happening. So if we talk about omenology that is being used in India and what is being used in the West as well, so it's a deeper, more concept, and synchronicity will be established in a very different way. But Richard Tarnas talks a lot about how various events coincides together, and he mentions that there is no real causal connection
It is a real thing that is happening in the world at a specific point of time, which is being indicated by something else, or something else that is happening with the cosmos, probably, because we are talking about astrology. So
yeah,
yeah.
the most famous probably the most famous example of this, some of your listeners probably maybe already know, but just in case people, it's almost like the archetypal example of synchronicity is from the practice of Carl Jung, and he was working with, and Tarnas actually includes this. And when Tarnas introduces a concept of synchronicity in this book, he cites this example. And Jung was working with this woman who was she was kind of frustrating him because she was so much trapped in this idea, that sort of Cartesian, overly rational, overly intellectual viewpoint, and not being able to open up to the interconnected soul of everything. And that, and this idea of like the world soul and that sort of thing, that we're embedded in this universe of meaning and soul. And so one day in a session in his office, she was telling him about this very powerful dream that involved this image of a golden scarab. And at this exact moment she's telling him this, they start hearing this like tapping at the window behind Jung. And he's really curious about that. And so he turns around, opens the window, and this insect flies into the room, which Jung immediately captures. And he looks at it, and it actually is the closest thing you could possibly get to a golden scarab. It's a type of beetle that was sort of greenish golden color. It's the closest thing in Switzerland that you could possibly have to an Egyptian golden scarab. And he just looks at it and he hands it to her, and he's like here's your scarab. And that just shattered. That was able to shatter something in her, where it opened her up to listening, and being her awareness and consciousness got kind of sparked and opened up, where it was able to, from that point forward, he was able to work with her more effectively. And that's the deeper level of synchronicity. It's the sort of thing where every single thing in the world going around you, your inner reality and what you're thinking about, or some experience that happened to you 20 years ago that's so powerful, then everything is like happening. It might be just like a passing conversation that somebody's having, or the sign on the road you're looking at. Everything in the world is reflecting this, and it's very disorienting because it makes it feel almost like you're the center of the universe, because everything is coming together in that point of time to reflect this meaning. But what Jung's work is showing us, that this is actually just revealing to you in this moment this idea of the world soul, that everything actually is interconnected in this way. So that's how Rick Tarnas uses that sort of idea in a more general way to talk about how archetypes work.
I think he has a specific chapter to kind of deal with how archetypes work, and he gives various listings of various principles of archetypal functioning and so on. So but I think even there, synchronicity plays a major role in terms of how a specific cycles of various planets, or transits of various planets, kind of bring various messages to us in terms of event manifestations, or manifestation of a specific planetary transit into our inner self, or whatever it may be. So so I think that's what he calls as assessing patterns of correlation. So correlation is again synchronicity, and he kind of moves around the word synchronicity, and he deals with transits, planetary cycles, in terms of talking about an individual, from individual natal chart perspective. So did you have something to talk about that, or
Sure. Well, one way let me see if I can try to pull these ideas together at the same time. So maybe we should just speak for a second about archetypes.
Yeah, sure.
And that, Jung, he didn't really make up this idea, but he's picked the term archetype for a reason. And it does go back in the Western tradition to the idea of the ideal eternal forms of Plato. And that, so something archetypal, like something that's a typical example people use is like something, whatever is considered beautiful. That's, we were drawn to something that's beautiful, but there is an archetypal eternal form of the beautiful that is transcendent and sort of beyond this. We could also think about love, or like the force of eros that flows through the world, and sort of like this, to use another kind of old Western term, it's like a daimonic force that kind of pulls things together. And a key thing, one of the areas where I'll see people criticize archetypal astrology or Jung, which shows they don't actually understand Jung, is where they think archetypes are like these crystallized ideas. And I think that's partially because of a lot of things Jung said have been taken in these different directions by Jungians and other people. And a lot of interpretations have been built off what he said. And it sort of starts getting more and more disconnected from what he was actually saying, what his ideas were. And one of the main things to understand about this is we can't ever actually know what the archetype is. All we can know, we only know the archetypes because of how they show up in symbols or in events. Myth and mythology is another place where, the archetypes, live and come alive. And that was a key thing that Jung really brought in, was that when we're talking about our inner unconscious, and the fact that our inner unconscious is actually a shaping force. There's something about our unconscious that's actually alive and has this sort of inner purpose, which is how this ends up getting connected in with astrology and like our natal charts. And so one thing is archetypes are sort of like this shaping force. Another thing is that there's sort of there can be a guiding purpose in a way behind them. So, and that's sort of the idea of like teleology. In Platonic thought, there's like the idea of the guardian daimon, or this inner force that sort of has an inner purpose that you're sort of being guided towards. In Jungian thought, instead of using the term like the daimon, he's just talking about the unconscious. When he's talking about individuation, that's sort of just making you an idea of you're getting a sense of what is this inner purpose, and really living into that inner purpose, finding wholeness through bringing conscious awareness into these unconscious depths. But when we're talking about what the way archetypes show up in the way that you're speaking to, which is really where Tarnas puts most of the focus on this book, is showing how they're also showing up in world events. So it's not just that we can take archetypal understanding and look at our natal chart and explore our inner psychology. We can also turn it on the outer world, and these archetypal forms are going to show up in correspondence with different archetypal planetary alignments. And they are, they're multivalent. Actually, I do have a list here of some of the terms he used: multidimensional, multivalent, indeterminate, contextual, participatory, creative, dynamic, pervasive, non-local, holographic, recursive, and multi-relational. Some of those key terms are things like being like non-local, that they'll show up at different points at different times, and that some of these insights we've had over time about how we kind of realize our subjective perception on things actually changes the relationship of what it is. Like, for example, I have a master in teaching program, and we know from, I have a master in teaching degree, and we know from teaching that the perspective of the teacher impacts the learning of the student. And so archetypes are the same thing. There is an aspect of them that are relational. There is a co-participation. So we can look at some of, there's like these sort of archetypal, there's this field, multivalent field of archetypal patterns that can sort of be constellated in alignment with these outer planet configurations. So much to the point that when you're reading what he's saying about Saturn and Pluto, which was written, back in the early 2000s, sort of in the aftermath of the September 11th world trade bombing in our country, which was a Saturn-Pluto opposition, it goes exactly, it's crazy how much it aligns with what's going on in the world right now, with Saturn and Pluto now coming together.
Okay. I'm just totally into it. So, but I'm kind of, itching to move to the, zone of world events.
Yeah.
The revolutions and, war situations, because that is probably the, most, the entire book is interesting, but this is my best portion in the book, where he talks about French revolutions, Uranus-Pluto cycles, World War, Cold War, 9/11, and also some of the incidences in other parts of the world with, a lot of historical details and backup to support various planetary cycles and manifestations. So, the most important thing here is that he explores the significance of outer planets when it comes to mundane events, and it again emphasizes the astute knowledge that Richard Tarnas had about astrology and its correlation to the world events. Obviously, he has learned a lot about depth psychology, and he knows what synchronicity is. So he knew how to correlate. Not necessarily how to correlate, because we are not doing cause and effect stuff, but still the actual correlation of planetary cycles and positions with the world events. So this is one of the most favorite parts of the book, and he talks in length about French Revolution. So I'm not sure about.
Yeah, I'd be curious, what was your experience? Because I know you were telling me you never used Uranus, Pluto, Neptune before reading this book. So how did that? I'm really curious to hear your
yeah. So
what that was like for you.
So the thing is that I knew Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were mainstay in Western astrology, and they had a lot to, the significations, the archetypes, and everything, except for the fact that I don't necessarily agree with the rulerships given to the outer planets. But still, the usage of the outer planets by modern Western astrologers kind of blew me away, because the first instance, I never kind of tried to work with outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Before that, I'm not even using it in my practice even today. So that's the stage I am in. But still, I'm completely at awe in terms of reading what various people write about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, because I've read a lot of articles, especially mundane articles, that keep coming in. I'm a huge fan of what Gary Lawrenson does in terms of mundane astrology. I'm a fan of what John Davenport does in terms of what mundane astrology is. So I read a lot of mundane astrology stuff, and no mundane article comes without huge emphasis of Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto. So and especially when you go to, I'm talking at mundane level, but at an individual point of view, I think evolutionary astrologers have done some really groundbreaking stuff when it comes to dealing with the outer planets. I've done some videos with Steve Wolfson, who's an evolutionary astrologer.
Oh yeah, I know Steve. I like him.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of his, big fan of his astrology, and big fan of his explanation about how various events manifest in terms of real-time experiences, and what kind of learnings that we can extract from a specific position or a specific configuration that an outer planet makes with a personal planet or another outer planet. So the degree or intensity of that particular experience, or the way we get forced to kind of experience a specific thing, or how we are. We are pushed to the corner, and we ought to experience it, and we don't have another choice when an outer planet says something. So these are some of the most important things that I try to inculcate, and I follow this EA Zoom meetings Facebook group very regularly, because that is where I get a lot of you know uh, the outer planet stuff, especially from the evolutionary astrology point of view. And I work very closely with my friend Tara All, who is also an evolutionary astrologer. So I don't practice evolutionary brand of astrology myself, but I kind of take up what they try to say, or what they try to establish. I've read Stephen Forrest's 2 books, so that uh, it, so I totally succumb to the usage of outer planets, and I'm there with it, but still I don't have the guts to kind of use it in my regular practice, because I don't think I'm really up to the mark. But I think I'm super motivated to write about the mundane events. I won't kind of write about the individual charts, but mundane cycles for sure. I think it's even more fascinating to write about how specific Neptune configuration with a specific planet had specific impact in world events, especially socio-cultural events or socio-political.
Yeah.
So so there is no question about the usage of mundane, the outer planets at all. So it's amazing.
Yeah, and interesting you mentioned Steve Wolfson, because I know he learned from the Jeff Green style of evolutionary astrology. And one thing that Jeff Green's, because I actually learned that too in the past, that's very much rooted in sort of idea really developed by Dane Rudhyar around using the lunation cycle. And that lunation cycle being applied to outer planets is basically what Rick Tarnas is doing, using sort of a 4th harmonic for the most part, of focusing on planetary conjunctions, which are sort of like the idea of like a new moon in a way between the archetypes, whatever they are. So it's like almost like a Uranus-Pluto new thing coming in. So that would be like, for example, the mid-1960s, right? And then you get to the first quarter square, which is this point of dynamic change and kind of, and it's waxing, right? It's growth oriented, it's propulsive. And that, like Rudhyar, for example, talked about like sort of crises even showing up that we really have to respond to and take action on. And that was the Uranus-Pluto came into their first quarter square, for example, back like 2010 to 2015 or so, like something like that. And then you get to the opposition, and that's sort of like this great tension of the 2 archetypal forces are in opposition. Is this great tension of the tension of the opposites that Jung actually talked about can kind of be brought into that. And it's another really dynamic point of big events happening. So for example, with the Saturn-Pluto cycle we're in right now, the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction was in the early 1980s. In America, we had this rise of like conservatism with like the Ronald Reagan Republican administration. As part of Ronald Reagan's administration, they were actually giving money and trying to develop figures actually like Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, and these different figures that ultimately through that cycle, we get to the Saturn-Pluto opposition, and in this country we end up having the World Trade bombing, right? And and if you go back to the previous one before that, in the mid-1940s, in America was very much kind of constantly, that's like the Cold War coming in, right? And then we get to the next one in the 80s, and we have Reagan. It's sort of like the ending of the Cold War as that cycle gets going. And in our country, it's very much been this idea of like this like threat of terrorism now. And then at the same time, we get that Saturn-Pluto opposition. We get stuff in our country like the Department of Homeland Security created. we get these things passed that enable the government to take all of our private data, right? And now we're at the close of that cycle. So being at the close of the cycle like we're at now, we're sort of facing everything of this entire cycle that started back in the early 80s. But as Tarnas shows in this book, we can actually connect right now to all past periods of Saturn-Pluto alignments. And you can do this with any planet. Like, it's actually interesting too, even like the Jupiter. If I think about myself and the Jupiter-Neptune cycle, I don't remember, like I said at the beginning, I'm not sure the date, but I think I probably found this book around the time of the last Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, which was in Aquarius in 2009. Oh. And one of the major themes we're in right now is we're in a Jupiter-Neptune last quarter square. So for me personally, like, it's actually very meaningful that I'm here talking to you about this book now, because it's sort of like the last quarter square of this Jupiter-Neptune cycle. The last quarter square is kind of like in a way, a harvesting, but also it can be another crisis of like facing the whole implications of this whole meaning of the whole cycle. It's another square of like something really impactful coming through. And so, at the same time we're coming to the close of a Saturn-Pluto cycle, we could also right now talk about the Jupiter-Neptune cycle, and they're at a last quarter square. And so you can start bringing all these different things in, and depending on which one you're looking at, it's going to sort of lead your awareness to a different aspect of the events going on. Hopefully that made sense.
For sure. So, okay, Uranus, Pluto cycles, and I think he gives somewhere in the chapter dealing with world events, he gives, just before starting with Uranus, Pluto cycles, where he talks about the French Revolution and other examples of Uranus, Pluto cycles, he just gives some kind of significations for Uranus, or archetypal significations. So for Uranus, he says emancipatory, rebellious, progressive, innovative, awakening, disruptive, destabilizing, unpredictable, serving to catalyze new beginnings and sudden unexpected changes, which is pretty much what every one of us will kind of talk about Uranus. So, and for Pluto, he says elemental, instinctual, powerful, compelling, extreme in its intensity, arising from the depth, destructive, overwhelming, and transformative, ever-evolving. So ever-evolving is one of those terms that kind of stuck to me for a long time, and it is something that evolutionary astrologers love it. So
what about that what about that's really meaningful to you?
Ever evolving is, as far as the evolutionary astrology is concerned, Pluto has a deep meaning to our inner self, and what inner self and the man, physical being, which I call, but evolutionary astrologers call it as a soul, and its journey is, its journey is kind of, they call it as a soul's journey, where I call it as a man's journey. To me, the soul is omnipresent and its state is never changed. But evolutionary astrology says that the soul kind of changes based upon its experiences, or the real-time experiences that it faces, and they kind of link it with past life memories or past life events, and they see a correlation and relativity with our current life in terms of how things are manifesting. So Pluto in many ways kind of represent the soul and our own inner self itself, and we are not necessarily forced, but we are kind of submitting ourselves to kind of have that kind of evolution or the transformation of our own soul, not our own, not myself, but my soul. That's what evolutionary astrology says. So I can easily kind of relate to anything that is Pluto, or anything that is related to Pluto as something that evolves over a period of time. A long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
I mean, one of the things about Pluto is it definitely it kind of breaks. There's like this breaking things down,
Mm-hmm.
and it does lead to things evolving, because things sort of as things kind of fall apart, there's sort of like this regenerative aspect to it. I mean, just to tie this back in with what we mentioned at the start of our talk, it actually ties in with the Copernicus revolution. So in 1543, there was a Uranus-Pluto opposition, and that's when Copernicus actually published De Revolutionibus. And then, so that was the Uranus-Pluto opposition. The next time they actually came together at the conjunction during 1592 to 1602, that was a period where both Kepler and Galileo were like fully, embracing this heliocentric theory and doing lots of really important work with it. And that's the sort of thing that we can see kind of over time. So interestingly, Rick Tarnas putting this book out, when he did, was sort of right at the entry point. When this book came out, we were kind of about to enter a Uranus-Pluto time period, and he's somebody that wasn't born at the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, but his living through the Uranus-Pluto conjunction during the 1960s was definitely a very formative, experience, which very much kind of put him on track to do that. So, and that's a kind of
60s. So 1960s
in Virgo.
Yeah. So I have some. I tried to kind of take up some events for that particular period from 1960 to 1970. I think the conjunction was from 1960 to 1972, if I'm not wrong. But still, some of the events are. Do you mind if I just read some of the events that took place from 1960 to 70?
Sure.
Freedom rights. 23rd Amendment gives District of Columbia the right to vote for president. Berlin crisis. Bay of Pigs, 16,000 in Vietnam, which is one of the saddest stories. Cuban Missile Crisis. Civil Rights March on Washington of 1963. John F. Kennedy assassinated. And free speech movement at Berkeley. 24th Amendment outlaws the poll. I'm not sure what it is. 24th Amendment outlaws the poll tax. I think it is related to something in America. War on poverty. Malcolm X assassinated. Operation Rolling Thunder in Vietnam. Black Power. France withdraws from NATO. Peace movement in the US. Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King murdered. Richard Nixon elected president. First man on the moon. And there is a lot more, but I think this kind of explains us about that particular period of Uranus-Pluto conjunction. So it was also formative, but it was also destructive. So it is. I think it is the fine line between moving from destructive to formative. So
yeah, it's definitely destructive. And one of the things that we can think about is how we have moved recently in this present day and age from a Uranus-Pluto time into a Saturn-Pluto time.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to the time period you were just discussing, right, in the 60s, there was this great eruption. Like one of the archetypes that Rick Tarnas connects with Pluto is Dionysus. And that there was a sort of Dionysian eruption in the collective. And in the United States, there was like this massive counterculture movement. There were a lot of liberation movements like you're speaking of. There was liberation movements among women, among Native Americans, among African Americans, among Latino Americans, among all these different groups. And then when we came into like I mentioned earlier, like the early 1980s, we get Ronald Reagan, we get the sort of conservative reaction where we then have we have 2 administrations of Ronald Reagan in this country, followed by George Bush, we have this empowerment of this religious right, which are this sort of, in a way, sort of Christian fundamentalism mixed in with conservative politics, sort of coming out of that Saturn, Pluto, talking about things like family values that are sort of like a moralistic, persecutory judgment against some of those emancipatory Uranus-Pluto themes that emerged in the 60s. And in this country, we then, during the Uranus-Pluto square, which was like 2010, maybe you have the dates on it, was it maybe it sort of started coming in 2008 or 2000, but 2010 to 2015 or so was like the really intense period of it, if I'm remembering the dates right. But for example, in the United States, we had, Barack Obama getting elected, which is like the first African-American president, which just as a symbol of itself was a very like remarkable thing. And we had things like, as that square came together, there was like the Occupy movement in this country.
And Bin Laden was assassinated. Bin Laden was killed as well.
Yeah, Bin Laden was killed, right. We had the Arab Spring. We had the revolution in Egypt. We had a lot of there were some revolutionary things happening, but then as we've kind of been leaving, there's also like you're saying, it's also very destructive. And while in some sense we've had this we can also see going on at the same time, there are some progressive ideas. There is emancipation happening. There are a lot of people organizing on behalf of Uranian liberating themes. As we've come tighter and tighter into the Saturn-Pluto thing, we're seeing this again, this sort of like Saturn coming in. We're seeing this rise of nationalism. In our country, we have a major issue around white supremacy and racism. We have the totalitarian things starting to emerge again. And one of the aspects that's talked about with the Saturn-Pluto is this idea of not just conservative empowerment, but the shadow, and that people will sort of persecute or terrorize like the other, and they'll sort of like project, their unconscious, turning the other into like this evil thing, and even though they themselves start acting that way. And so, for example, there's lots of stuff about looking at immigrants as all immigrants are all evil, people trying to flee terrible situations in their own land are actually, infesting our country. And there's a lot, we're going to build a wall. We're going to build a wall to keep these people out. And, it's extremely Saturn-Pluto. And so what's interesting is we can see we've gone from Uranus-Pluto into this intensified Saturn-Pluto. And yet at the same time, we know we're going to be coming, Jupiter next year is going to come in. And Tarnas talks a lot about in this book of Jupiter sort of playing the role that, you're familiar with, I'm sure with like the moon, the way the moon translates the light of planets, because Jupiter is sort of the fastest moving thing that we're talking about in this context. It often is Jupiter. Sure. Jupiter that's translating the light. And so when Jupiter moves through and starts connecting these things, that's when a lot of stuff happens. And that's where we are right now. We got Jupiter squaring Neptune. Jupiter's going to move on from squaring Neptune. Next year, it's going to go to Capricorn. It's going to unite with Pluto. It's then going to move on and unite with Saturn. It's then going to square Uranus. And at the same time, Saturn's going to separate from Pluto, and Saturn's going to start squaring Uranus. Yeah. So now we know we're going from Uranus, Pluto into sort of Saturn, Pluto into Jupiter, Saturn, into Saturn, Uranus, Jupiter, Uranus. So you can sort of see how there's all sorts of different things are brought up by these ideas. And what's great about this book is as you start familiarizing yourself with it, you can start seeing it. It's remarkable how closely things will start showing up that go exactly the way Rick Tarnas is describing them in this book.
Exactly. So I think there is a lot of socio-economic, socio-political changes. I mean, destructions and formations are about to be. Uh, I mean, we cannot, escape it. So it's going to be there very soon. So I think you also spoke some stuff about what is in store in terms of planetary alignments. So, did you have something else to talk about, or some other stuff that we wanted to touch upon? Because I think this is what I had in my mind.
Okay. Do you want to talk? I mean, we could talk more about Saturn, Pluto if you want. And then I do have some notes on Saturn, Uranus also, if you want to start looking at that at all. But yeah, what I can do in any of that.
No, maybe I think we can actually do it as a separate part of another video as well. Which
Okay.
which will be more easier, because I think it will be too much of information in one. So
Yeah.
I actually expected this when we are talking about something like this. So it's very much possible. So
Okay.
thank you so much for joining, and
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
thanks.